You open your eyes on your own schedule. No alarm cutting through a dream. No glowing number on a nightstand telling you that you are already behind before your feet have touched the floor. The fire from last night has burned down to a bed of orange coals, and somewhere close by, a child is already awake, poking at the ash with a stick just to watch it glow. You sit up. You stretch. You do not check anything. For a few long minutes, you simply exist. And nothing is required of you yet. There is no meeting in 40 minutes. There is no inbox refilling itself overnight. There is no manager wondering where you are. For roughly 300,000 years, this was not a fantasy version of a morning. This was Tuesday. This was every single morning for every human being who ever lived, across almost the entire span of our species. And the day that followed that unhurried waking looked almost nothing like the one you are about to have today, and it did not depend on luck, or wealth, or which part of the world you happen to be born into. It was simply the default setting of being human. Here is a number that should bother you more than it does. The average person alive today will spend around 90,000 hours of their life at work. That is roughly a third of every waking hour you will ever have, signed over before you even know what you actually want to do with it. Add commuting. Add the mental residue of work that follows you home. And the real number climbs higher still. We treat this as simply how life is. Wake up, get ready, go to a job, come home too tired to do much else. Repeat that pattern for around 40 years. And then, if you are fortunate, retire into the kind of unstructured freedom you spent your entire working life waiting for. But here is the part almost nobody stops to ask. For the overwhelming majority of human history, jobs did not exist, not in any form you would recognize. No employment contracts, no wages, no boss deciding what your Tuesday looks like, no career ladder to climb toward a corner office that may or may not ever exist, no performance review measuring your worth against a quota. So if there was no job to go to, what did people actually do with their days? Not for one strange, isolated tribe somewhere, cut off from the modern world by accident of geography. For every human being on Earth, for the vast majority of the time, our species has existed. In the late 1960s, anthropologist Richard Lee spent months living with and carefully timing the daily activities of the Hoansi people of the Kalahari, in what is now Botswana and Namibia, one of the last groups whose way of life still closely resembled the foraging lifestyle that defined almost all of human history before agriculture. What he documented broke a myth that had stood for centuries, the assumption that so-called primitive life must have been a desperate, nonstop grind for survival. Lee found that Hoansi adults spent an average of around 2 to 3 days per week acquiring food. That works out to somewhere between 15 and 20 hours of subsistence work weekly. The rest of the time was theirs, to spend however they chose. This was not a fluke of one unusually lucky environment. Anthropologist Marshall Solins took Lee's data and similar findings from other foraging societies and coined a phrase that still unsettles people who hear it for the first time: the original affluent society. Not affluent in the sense of owning things, but affluent in the sense that mattered most: an abundance of time. And the pattern kept repeating everywhere researchers looked. The Hadza of Tanzania, the Ach of Paraguay, the Martu of the Western Australian desert. Later fieldwork among Amazonian foraging groups studied by researchers Hillard Kaplan and Michael Gervin found the same rough shape again, even in dense, resource-rich rainforest environments where you might expect subsistence to demand far more effort. Completely different continents, completely different climates, completely different diets, completely different histories of contact with the outside world. The same rough answer kept coming back: somewhere around 15 to 20 hours a week spent on activities directly tied to survival. For comparison, if you work what is considered a normal full-time job today, you are very likely putting in more than double that before you have even started commuting, cooking, or answering an email after dinner. And that gap is not a rounding error. It is the difference between a life built around subsistence and a life built around an entire additional system layered on top of subsistence. It is also worth being honest about where this figure does not apply cleanly. Some foraging environments, particularly harsh deserts or seasons of scarcity, demanded far more effort than 15 hours, and anthropologists still debate exactly how representative any single study group is of the deep past. But even the more conservative estimates, once you average across good seasons and lean ones, rarely climb anywhere near the 40-plus hours treated as completely normal in a modern working week, and none of them come with the added mental weight of a job that follows you home. This kind of leisure did not come from a lack of ambition. It came from a completely different social operating system, one with almost no tolerance for anyone accumulating more status, more food, or more authority than anyone else. Richard Lee documented this directly in an episode that has become famous in anthropology. After he purchased a large ox as a generous Christmas gift for the community he was studying, he was met not with gratitude, but with relentless mockery. The animal, he was told again and again, was scrawny, barely worth the trouble of butchering. Confused, he later learned this ridicule was deliberate and routine, aimed at anyone whose gift or kill might otherwise inflate their ego. Foraging societies like this, one had strong, largely unspoken rules against boasting, against hoarding, against letting a good hunt turn into a claim on status. Meat from a large kill was not kept by the hunter. It was divided by custom among the entire group, following rules everyone understood without needing them written down. Anthropologists call this a reverse dominance hierarchy, a social structure actively organized to prevent any single person from rising too far above everyone else. There was no landlord, there was no owner of the waterhole, there was no inherited fortune to protect or extend, which meant there was also no one whose job it was to manage, guard, or grow that fortune. Status still existed, but it was earned through skill, generosity, and humor, and it evaporated the moment someone tried to hold on to it too tightly. Remove the latter, and suddenly the 15 to 20 hours you need to survive is simply the whole of what your days demand. You might be thinking, fine, but that is modern foraging groups. How do we know ancient humans, tens of thousands of years ago, lived anything like this? The answer, it turns out, is written directly into bone. When archaeologists compare the skeletons of pre-agricultural humans to the skeletons of the earliest farmers who came after them, the difference is dramatic and consistent. Early farmers were noticeably shorter than the foragers who preceded them in the same regions. Sometimes by several centimeters on average, their teeth show far more cavities and enamel defects, a direct result of diets suddenly dominated by starchy grain instead of varied wild foods. Their spines and joints carry the unmistakable wear patterns of repetitive, high-intensity physical labor, the kind of damage you would expect from years of bending, hauling, and grinding grain by hand. Researchers studying skeletal populations across the transition to agriculture, including work associated with bioarchaeologists George Armelagos and Mark Cohen, found consistent markers of nutritional stress appearing in bone almost exactly when farming begins in a given region, region after region, continent after continent. And on average, early farmers died younger. Pre-agricultural human skeletons tell a different story. Taller, fewer dental problems, far less joint degeneration. The bones simply do not support the old assumption that hunter-gatherer life was a brutal, non-stop physical grind. If anything, the evidence points the other way. Early farming, not foraging, was the harder, more punishing lifestyle on the human body, at least in its first several thousand years, before agricultural technique, crop diversity, and food storage eventually improved. But the most striking evidence is not about survival at all. It is about the things ancient humans made when survival was not the point. In 1994, explorers discovered Chauvet Cave in southern France. Deep inside, painted roughly 30 to 36,000 years ago, were images of horses, lions, and rhinoceroses rendered with a level of perspective, shading, and movement that surprised even the archaeologists who found them. These were not crude scratches. This was sophisticated art, requiring real skill, planning, and above all, time. Someone crawled deep into total darkness, worked by flickering firelight, and spent hours, likely days, painting animals on a wall, not for food, not for defense, but for beauty, for meaning, or simply because they wanted to. In Blombos cave in South Africa, archaeologists found shell beads deliberately pierced with tiny holes, dated to roughly 75,000 years ago, clearly meant to be strung together as jewelry. The nearest coastline was kilometers away. Someone made that round trip on foot just to gather shells, then spent careful hours drilling through each one with a stone tool, purely to look good. Alongside the beads, researchers at the same site found engraved pieces of ochre, deliberately marked with repeating cross-hatched patterns that served no practical function whatsoever. Among the oldest deliberate abstract designs ever found. In Germany, researchers uncovered a flute carved from a bird's bone, roughly 40,000 years old, with finger holes precisely spaced to produce a scale. Whoever carved it understood pitch, spacing, and airflow, and they invested real time into an object with no survival function whatsoever, except the making of music. These are not isolated oddities. Across Europe, Africa, and Asia, sites tens of thousands of years old are consistently full of decorative objects, tools far more elaborately finished than survival required, and items that clearly took hours of focused, non-essential work. This is what people did with the hours that were left over once the food question was handled. They created, they decorated, they made things beautiful, purely because that is something being human seems to compel us to do once we have the time to do it. So let's put a full day back together. You wake around dawn, the fire is still smoldering from the night before, and someone feeds it a little more wood. Breakfast is whatever is left from yesterday. Some meat, maybe nuts or fruit gathered the day before. It is eaten sitting close together, and it is social. People talk, they loosely sketch out the day ahead, not because anyone is required to, but because that is simply what humans do with each other in the morning. By mid-morning, a small group might set out to hunt or gather. But here is the key detail people miss. You do not go every single day. If the last hunt went well and there is food stored, an entire day might pass with no one leaving camp at all. Instead, the morning goes into tool work, sharpening a spear point, weaving a basket, softening a hide by hand, napping a new stone blade from a core someone has been carrying for weeks. This is not labor in the way you experience labor. There is no clock. There is no supervisor checking on progress. People do it because skill earns respect, and because doing a task well is quietly satisfying, in a way that clocking in rarely is. When a hunt does happen, it is not the frantic sprint you have seen in movies. Many ancient human groups were persistence hunters, tracking an animal at a slow, steady jog for hours in open heat until the animal overheats and collapses, unable to shed body heat the way a sweating, upright human can. It is a strange advantage, but it is ours almost alone in the animal kingdom, built on nothing more exotic than sweat glands and the willingness to keep moving after the animal has already outrun you twice. A hunt like this, including the walk out and the walk back, might take 3 to 6 hours in total. The animal is carried home, shared out among the group according to rules everyone already understands, and by early afternoon, the physically demanding part of the day is essentially finished. What happens next is the part modern life makes almost impossible to imagine. Nothing in particular and everything that actually matters. People rest in whatever shade is available. They talk, they play with children, inventing games out of nothing more than sticks and open ground. They groom each other's hair, picking through it slowly, a small physical ritual that reinforces trust between people who depend on each other completely. They carve small decorations into bone or wood. Some simply nap through the heat of the afternoon, the way much of the animal world already does and always has. Older members of the group, no longer expected to hunt or carry heavy loads, often take on a different but equally essential role during these afternoon hours, minding children, passing down which plants are safe to eat and which are not, repairing tools, and settling small disputes before they grow into larger ones. This is a form of contribution with no retirement age attached to it, because there is no job to retire from in the first place, only a shifting set of things a body can still usefully do. As the sun goes down, the entire tone of the day shifts, and the fire becomes the center of everything. Anthropologist James Sussman, who has spent decades studying the Hoansi, documented that adults in these communities spend roughly 6 hours a day in what he calls social time, not working, not sleeping, simply being with other people, talking, laughing, telling jokes. That number is not incidental. In a world with no money, no police, and no written contracts, your survival depends entirely on your relationships. If people do not trust you, they are under no obligation to share food with you when your own hunt fails, or to help you when you are sick, or to take in your children if something happens to you. So an enormous amount of time gets invested in exactly those bonds. Not because it is efficient, but because it is the actual infrastructure holding the group together, doing the job that insurance, contracts, and social safety nets attempt to do for you today, far less personally and far less reliably. Researcher Polly Wisner spent years recording and analyzing conversations among the Hoansi and found something remarkable about how the content of talk shifts with the sun. During the day, conversation is mostly practical, where animal tracks were spotted, which plants are ready, the occasional complaint about someone not sharing fairly. But after dark, around the fire, the overwhelming majority of conversation turns to story. Myths about how the world began, tales of ancestors doing impossible things, jokes, accounts of distant places and distant relatives. Wisner argued that this nightly shift is where a huge amount of human culture was actually built. Gods, legends, shared history, imagined futures, the kind of thinking that only really happens once your stomach is full, the fire is warm, and you finally feel safe enough to simply think out loud with other people, with nothing left to defend and nowhere else you need to be. And sleep itself did not look like yours. Historical research into sleep patterns before artificial lighting, including work by historian Roger Eckertz drawing on centuries of diaries, court records, and medical texts, suggests that humans commonly slept in two distinct phases through the long hours of darkness. A first sleep of several hours, followed by a quiet waking period of an hour or two spent in the dark, thinking, talking softly, sometimes tending the fire, before a second sleep carried people through until dawn. That waking gap was not insomnia. It was simply built into the shape of the night, a private, unhurried stretch of consciousness that modern sleep, compressed into one uninterrupted block and bookended by an alarm, no longer leaves room for it all.
Then, roughly 10,000 to 12,000 years ago, something changed permanently. In the region known as the Fertile Crescent, humans began deliberately planting seeds and domesticating animals. Agriculture. And agriculture, it turns out, is a trap in the truest sense. Once you start farming, you can support more people on the same amount of land. More people means more mouths that need feeding. More mouths means more farming is required just to keep pace. Within a handful of generations, populations grew past the point where returning to hunting and gathering could ever feed everyone again. There was no going back, no matter how much harder the new way of life turned out to be. And farming demanded far more labor than foraging ever had. Plowing, planting, weeding, harvesting, storing surplus, and defending that surplus from both animals and other hungry humans who now had every reason to want to take it. The skeletal record from this period is unambiguous. Early farmers worked harder, ate a narrower and less nutritious diet, and died younger than the foragers who came immediately before them. But the population kept climbing anyway, because it had to, because there were now simply too many people to feed any other way. And with larger, denser populations came specialization. Toolmakers, potters, weavers, and eventually soldiers, priests, administrators, and rulers, each one requiring the labor of everyone below them to be fed. Somewhere in that slow, multi-thousand-year unwinding, the modern idea of a job was born. The idea that your time now belongs in large part to someone else in exchange for the resources you need to survive. Resources you once simply gathered or hunted for yourself in 15 hours a week. It is worth noticing how much of modern life is spent quietly trying to recreate what foragers already had for free. We build entire industries around retreats, sabbaticals, and vacations, engineered to deliver a few days of exactly the unstructured, unscheduled time that used to be the ordinary texture of every single week. We pay for meditation apps to recover a kind of present moment ease that does not require much recovering, when there is no inbox waiting on the other side of it. We treat retirement as the finish line, the reward waiting at the end of 40 years of work, without noticing that we are describing almost exactly the daily baseline our ancestors woke up into as children. None of this is an accident, and none of it is a personal failing. It is simply what happens when an entire economic system is built on the assumption that human time is a resource to be purchased, rather than something that already by default belongs to the person living it.
By the time cities existed, the original human rhythm was gone, replaced permanently by schedules, obligations, and the requirement to spend most of your waking hours working simply to survive inside the system that agriculture had built. Today you spend roughly 90,000 hours of your life working. Your distant ancestors spent a fraction of that on anything resembling labor. You sleep in one solid block and call waking at 2 in the morning insomnia. They slept in 2 and used the gap for quiet reflection instead of anxiety. You spend years chasing markers of success that a modern economy invented and then sold back to you. They woke up each morning already free, with nothing in particular left to prove. You make art if you can find spare time after your job is done. They made art because they had the time, and because making something beautiful was simply part of being human. We are not a different species from them. Genetically, biologically, in every measurable way that matters, you are the same animal that woke up unhurried beside that fire 300,000 years ago. Your body still expects the long, unstructured stretches of rest, the daily dose of unscripted social contact, the mix of movement and stillness that shaped it over that entire span of time. What has changed is not us. What changed is the deal we now live under, so gradually and so completely that most of us never think to question it at all. And yet, we live so differently from the way humans lived for the overwhelming majority of our history that, in practice, we might as well be a different species entirely. None of this means the modern world has nothing worth having. Medicine, safety, comfort, these are real, and they are not nothing. And almost no one living today would trade away all of it to stand permanently at 15 hours a week with none of it. But it is worth sitting with the fact that, for nearly the entire story of our species, a human being's default day looked like 15 to 20 hours of purposeful work, 6 hours of connection with other people, roughly 8 hours of rest, and time left over simply to exist without needing to justify it. That was not a luxury reserved for the lucky few. That was the baseline for everyone for 300,000 years. So the next time your alarm goes off before you're ready, before the sun is even up, it might be worth asking exactly when and exactly why that ever became the deal, and how much of your life you would trade to get even a small piece of that baseline back.